This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, and what I think is interesting thinking about the poem itself is the way, the best word I think is democratic, the way it searches for all these different Englishes, you know, take out your pencils, the people in the fields. How did that, I don't want to say come about, but how conscious was that? How organic was that? I love your example of the sort of yogurt and thinking about your process as organic, because I think especially students don't always think about that and the different metaphors for writing. And you know, that's a wonderful one, and so is the arranging of ordinary objects like your mother would and making them magical, what you call the black interior. What do you make of this in terms of the specifically the inaugural poem?
Well, it was very hard to think about, but also, I mean, a privilege really, to think about America right now, you know. And in coming out, I was a very, very, very avid and impassioned follower of the Obama campaign. It meant as much to me, you know, as anything has ever meant to me. I was just very, very, very closely following it. And what seemed so remarkable to me was the way he was very consciously trying to say America is many things and those things aren't always the same thing. It's many, which also to me seemed quintessentially Whitman-esque. You know, the clash and clatter, and you know, I am large, I contain multitudes. Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. Obama's rhetorical putting forth of that idea of Americanness, that it's not all about lining up and agreeing, which I think has been the very, very dangerous cant of the last 8 years. Just felt like, whoosh, just like the fresh wind, and a wind of real possibility. I mean, it's hard not to speak in cliches, but that's what it felt like. Yeah. So I think that certainly in thinking about this occasion in poems, it emerged from 2 years of following and thinking about what he was putting forth, and we spoke about this at lunch, how consistently he said, it's not about me. It's about all of these different people who have not only wanted this to happen, but who have worked for this. You know, nothing could be better than the example of all of the $5 donors. You know, the people I mean, the amount of money that he raised was extraordinary, but that he raised it from so many people giving a little bit, I think it is really very, very extraordinary as well. So I didn't want to be in any way condescending in thinking about what it meant to write something accessible or write something that might speak to a lot of different people. And I do know that you cannot anticipate your audience. You know, that I really do know. I mean, I can, you know, look at any number of you and have a whole conversation in my head. Well, I think that, you know, you'll like this or you won't like this. But how would I know? I mean, there's no way of knowing. And I've even, in thinking about people who are like me, whatever that is, right? You know, I think, okay, well, this is one of my kind of people, and they'll really get all my references. Well, sometimes that happens, you know, sometimes that happens. Professor Young and I share a life of the mind and culture and care about many, many of the same things. So I know that if we show each other poems, there's going to be that pleasure of, oh yeah, I get it, I get it, I get it, I get it. But that's a handful of people in your life, in my experience at least, not masses of people. Right. So you're always taking a risk and saying, these are my words. This is what I put out there. And the thing that's been a real blessing to me in the aftermath of this poem is that I've received hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of emails, letters, conversations with people who stop me in the street, all kinds of people. And I have to say, the majority of people who do not read poetry on a regular basis, although many who do, but who say, I connected with this, I heard that, saying phrases, saying lines back to me, people who engage with poems. So that's just been one of those rare, just blessings in life to be able to see that. And to me, it's not so much about my poem, it's about poetry, and about how people can meet poetry.
Excuse me. How can people meet poetry? I mean, how do you see them coming together? Because I was thinking when you were talking, not just about the things one understands, but the things, frankly, I learned, I think, as a young reader, reading your first book, for instance, and going, oh, I didn't know that about Monet, or I didn't know that about, Paul Robeson's wife, or, these figures who appear in your work. And I think it's more deep than simply teaching, though I think teaching is deep. I think there's also this kind of, I don't know, how do you bring people to the thing and lead them, perhaps? Are you conscious of that, or does it happen because you're just out there trying to find what you need to say?
Well, with my first book, which appeared first with University of Virginia Press, as they would tell me at the press, they'd say, my dear, there's your book, and then there's Mr. Jefferson, because it was an anomalous book of poetry. There was a poetry series that was at the University of Virginia Press for 2 seconds, so it had no other context at the press. But I remember the editors originally wanted me to put a zillion endnotes at the back. They wanted me to explain, everything. And, I was very, quite high dudgeon, like, I'm not going to say. But, part of, and what these people were saying was, your readers won't be familiar with these aspects of African American history and culture. Well, here's what I didn't like about that. First of all, we don't know who these people are. And also, let's be real, 1,000 copies of this book are going out into the world. That's not a lot of people. So let's just not worry about them. But you don't presume not only what people know, but what people will want to learn about. Right. And that's why, it's one thing if you're reading a Norton Critical Edition for class and you want all of that stuff right there as, frankly, an interruption to the experience of reading the poem because you're doing it for a class in literary criticism. That's one thing. But the things, I love what you say about what we learn from poems. The things, too, that I have learned as a reader of poetry. And as I hear my grandmother often on many topics, and I hear her saying, look it up. Look it up. Look it up. I mean, engage, learn, let the poem send you somewhere. Right. That process is a joyous part of the experience of reading poetry. Now, what I think also, and this is another answer to your question about how to meet poetry, I think also we need to meet it as music. We need to meet it as sound. We need to just say, listen to it and just relax. Let it happen to you. Let it wash over you. Hear it. There is, if I may rail for just 2 sentences about one of the things that's not so good in contemporary culture, is, and I'm not going to say, oh, the internet is bad. That's boring. But I do think that we're in a time, a culture of such rapid response that I notice this even sometimes really good students sometimes will answer without taking in what was said. That everything is like, you got to be quick, you got to be on it, you got to have a quick response. But sometimes you need to pause for a moment and take it in and truly reflect. Yet another thing that I think's been rather unusual about what Obama has put forth for us that I do see as related to poetry is that you see a kind of practicing of contemplation, that everything is not instant and tied up and tidy and pat. So I think that's what poetry can do, and I think that that's what I would love to see happen, for the whole wide world, is to say, just take a minute and let it happen to you, and don't worry if you don't understand everything. And then, the beauty of poems, go back to it, and then the ongoing engagement of the poem, moves forward.
I love what you said about music, because I think we're very familiar with that with music. We wouldn't expect to learn a song the first time we heard it, and we don't always, you're dancing, you don't necessarily know what the third verse of, and so, and in my church growing up, we wouldn't even sing the third verse, you sing 1, 2, and 4, So I think there's a kind of pleasure that somehow people don't associate with poetry that is musical, that is language lifted or let free or somehow highlighted. I'm not sure that's a question except to say that I totally understand what you're saying, and I think there's a freedom that I hear you talking about that I think is really important to remember. How nice it is to stop and think, and how rare
Well, that's right. And also, too, you were showing me in the library Gwendolyn Brooks's childhood dictionary. So Gwendolyn Brooks, I'll say it here, greatest poet of the 20th century. And in her childhood dictionary, she has these lists and definitions of just words that she just loves. Turgid, jasper, aquamarine, just words that unto themselves. And music and poetry, that's sort of one of the few places, and also, I guess in really great talking traditions, which, some places have really great talking traditions.
Here in the South, we have a great
I was going to say,
tradition.
exactly, in the South, and I notice it particularly in New Orleans. I think that there's a very, very particular talking tradition. Jamaicans have, I think, amongst people from the Caribbean, have a rather extraordinary figurative language talking tradition. So, just that pleasure, using the language with pleasure and precision so that you get even more focused on what you mean. That's a joy. Sir.
I wanted to ask, so the inaugural poem was the toughest you'd ever written and had a stack of drafts. Have you ever had a poem, maybe one of the poems in one of your books, that just sort of came to you and you put it down on paper, maybe one or two rewrites, and that was it, and you had it? Does that happen?
That would be lightning striking. And I think I've been hit twice. Couldn't tell you which poems, but I think it's happened maybe twice, that something's come all the way out. And I say that, that's the truth, but also I say it as an admonishment, which is to say, I don't think that's really how it happens. I don't think that's really how it happens. And I think that the challenge is how to keep, we were, all these food metaphors, we were talking last night about, biscuits with no air in them, right? About how to keep the air in the biscuit, how to make the biscuit be a spontaneous biscuit, even if it's been labored over. And that's really the challenge of poetry, because in my experience, it's like lightning striking, for something to come fully formed. Now that's not to say that sometimes drafts come rushing out, and you kind of gallop with that rhythm, because you've caught the groove, you've got the movement, and you just keep writing because you're following that. But in my experience, still there's shaping and work that's done after that.
Well, thinking of the biscuits, you wouldn't want to have someone's first attempt at a biscuit. Their 700th biscuit, that's a good biscuit, or better be. You better get, it's hard to get worse by practicing, I've found anything. And I think with, there's a sort of romance about poetry that it happens. And I've been fortunate, I could probably one poem a book for me has come in that kind of way that you're asking. But really, I consider that a lucky find. I praise whatever I need to praise and then move on to the hard work of readying to be ready for that poem, because it's like to switch tracks, it's like running a race. You can't just get up and run a marathon. You got to practice, and then when someone's chasing you, you got you can be ready. So I think there's a lot of ways of thinking of it. Are there any last questions? We're going to have to wrap up fairly soon.
This is a fairly simple question. I was just curious as to were you nervous before you spoke in front of all those people, or what was going on prior to that?
Everyone asks me, and the answer is I was not nervous. And I think that was for a couple of reasons. To me, the hard thing was writing the poem. And again, I approached this with every pragmatic bone in every ancestor's body leading up to me. It's the work, it's the job. You have a job to do. You have to write this poem. It's for the occasion. You have to do a good job. You have to get up. You have to deliver it. So there was all of that. But the struggle, the anxiety, the awful, the dark nights of the soul, that was in the writing of the poem. The delivering it was the releasing and letting it go. And certainly the experience was awesome. It was enormous and awesome to look out at all that people. It was enormous and awesome to be on that stage in a way, though, that I think is an experience shared by so many folks that I've talked to about, understanding the struggle that got us to this moment. when this man could be sworn in as president. So leading up to that, I was with my father on the stage. He's 75, and his work has been devoted to securing civil rights, mostly within government. And so, you know, he's one of the many, 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 many hands who got us to this day. And that was powerful. I was grateful that he and my mother could see this day, you know, and all of that emotion had been happening for months and months. You know, there's a point where I was like, I cannot talk to any more old black people. This is just too much, you know. I mean, just, you know, all of that emotion had sort of happened, even though it welled up again. It welled up again in that moment. So that Rocky had a question over there. Yes.
Is there any, like, do you ever have a feeling that you want to change something after you've written down the poem, after it's been published, or after you've said it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Poets are different about that. We were just looking at Langston Hughes' a book in which he made some very, very interesting changes in the published book that he then gave to someone. And there were some poets who are famous for, you know, revising to the grave. I mean, that they just, nothing is ever done. I'm very much of another school, which is to say done is done. And that in fact, I find it interesting, even though certainly there are poems from yesterday or from 20 years ago that I might think, oh, I might do that differently, or I don't really think I could do that better, differently. But I really did want there to be a record of who I was at different stages, and to see how the work moves and changes. I'm also a great believer in the historical record, going back to the thing itself and seeing what it has to say. I'm not a revisionist historian in the sense of, I am a revisionist historian. I mean that differently. I guess what I'm saying is I learn a lot from seeing how things were in a particular moment and then seeing how they change over time. So, you know, and I try not to have regrets, because to me, I put that energy into hopefully trying to write a better next poem. And I kind of believe in that, because otherwise recriminations, doesn't really feel productive. I'd rather figure out how to make something better the next time.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.